This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 156 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I'm an exhausted dad who's changed way too many diapers over the last 24 hours, so I'm trying to be as concise as possible. That means we'll just get into things right away this week. Before I read the first mailbag question, though, I wanted to remind you guys about NumberFire Premium. With NumberFire's customizable draft kit, you can just enter your league settings and get a custom draft board tailored to you. Plus, with NumberFire Premium, you get risk profiles, auction values, tier sheets, expert rankings, and so much more. That doesn't even include NumberFire's award-winning DFS tools, gambling picks, and premium content that also come with NumberFire Premium. First-time users can use promo code CHAMPION at checkout and get their first month of premium for just $9.99. That's promo code CHAMPION. Visit numberfire.com/premium for more details. The first question in this week's mailbag is from @RyanPollock5 on Twitter. It says, "Hey JJ, I'm in a league that pays out half the league buy-in each week for 12 weeks. Then once the playoffs start, the other half is paid out to the winner and second place team. Would you consider drafting differently in this scenario? Maybe stacking a quarterback and a wide receiver? Thanks, love the show." Obviously, stacking to maximize upside works, especially in a daily fantasy format. But my fear in giving that type of advice for this question is that it then forces you to be suboptimal. Like, you might force a quarterback draft or streaming selection when the matchup doesn't really call for it. And not only that, but since the entire player pool isn't there to choose from, it's going to be a lot tougher to actually become optimal or strive for that ceiling via a strategy like stacking. I also think that in situations like this, it depends what your goal is for your fantasy team. Are you trying to get back as much money as you can, or are you looking to win the championship? I would assume the latter is more important, so I really wouldn't change my strategy up all that much. This next question is from @Swolger24. Best rookie wide receiver to have the biggest production in 2018. My guess is Calvin Ridley. I'm not actually super high on Calvin Ridley here in year one. I think the easy go-tos for this question are Anthony Miller, Michael Gallup, and DJ Moore, with James Washington being sort of a dark horse. With Miller, he should immediately play the slot role in Chicago and should see decent volume as a result. Gallup obviously has the upside of just straight up becoming Dallas's top wideout, but we know Dallas also won't be throwing the ball all that much. And DJ Moore has the same upside, but there's more resistance with Devin Funchess, Christian McCaffrey, and Greg Olsen all in that offense. DJ Moore was my wide receiver one entering the draft, so I think that he has the most long-term upside, but it's not going to be as easy for him to see loads and loads of targets just given his situation as a rookie. I do hope that he can overtake Devin Funchess, though. And then, as I said on my Risers and Fallers podcast earlier this week, James Washington is probably going to play that Martavis Bryant role in the Steelers offense and see more volume than most expect. And he's a deep threat, so he's got an opportunity to score points in large bunches. If we're going by PPR, I think Anthony Miller is my best guess, but Miller, Gallup, and Moore are all pretty close for me. This next question is from @JoeyDecibels. What to do with the Washington, Detroit, and Indy backfields? All right, so let's start with Washington. Aside from Chris Thompson, I guess the guy that you'd want to draft is Adrian Peterson, because it's always hard to just count out Adrian Peterson. That's my analytical take on him. I don't think I'm going to draft all that much Adrian Peterson, but crazier things have happened in fantasy football. In Detroit, I'm very much a fan of Kerryon Johnson. He's a do-it-all back who's going to be playing behind an improved offensive line and an offense that's going to score points. And he's just one of those players that's tough to see a high ceiling from a projection standpoint. But if things break his way, he could legitimately be a big breakout player this year. It's just that you have LeGarrette Blount stealing some early down work and potential goal line work, and Theo Riddick is still there stealing passing down work. But Johnson at least has the most upside from purely a talent standpoint, and the Lions clearly think that he's good after trading up to get him in the draft. I've actually targeted Kerryon Johnson quite a bit in drafts because I do think the ceiling is pretty high. I just know that it might be tough to rely on him consistently at the start of the season. And then with Indianapolis, I talked about how I'm generally not drafting Marlon Mack, even though I do think that he's got the best odds to score the most points in the Colts backfield this year. I'm just playing probability. Mack struggled to consistently gain positive yardage last year, and by a lot of metrics, you guys, Frank Gore outplayed him. But the Colts have also not thrown rookie Jordan Wilkins in with the first team in the preseason, and Nyheim Hines has struggled holding onto the ball. And max ADP has fallen enough because of his hamstring injury that he's far less risky of a buy than he was even 2 weeks ago. So my advice with the Colts backfield is to target it, but diversify if you're playing in multiple leagues. Maybe you get Mack in one league and then Jordan Wilkins in another. If you're playing in one league, I'd probably just target Wilkins for upside just given his cost. He's looked decent and he was a very efficient college prospect. I just worry because he didn't have great usage in college, and that's one thing that I look for in a back who's transitioning to the NFL. This next question says, "Hi JJ, what's your opinion on Chris Ivory's fantasy outlook if and when McCoy gets suspended? Do you think he gets the majority of the team's touches? Thanks, Jeremy in Texas." You need a lot of things to happen in order for Chris Ivory to give you fantasy points. You need an injury or a suspension to LaShawn McCoy, and then if Ivory's on the field, you need him to produce. And that won't be easy behind a bad offensive line and what could be a bottom-tiered offense. Since we don't even know when a potential suspension would be handed out, that means you're basically drafting Ivory as a handcuff right now. And while I don't advise handcuffing in non-deep leagues, if you're going to handcuff, Chris Ivory shouldn't be at the top of the list. You should be looking at players like James Conner, Rod Smith, Chase Edmonds, Latavius Murray. There are lots of dudes who I'd rather have at the end of a deep draft than Chris Ivory. This next question is from @bunch_91. If a tight end is getting 1.5 points per reception, do you start taking the top 3 earlier than their ADP? Or is the best strategy to wait it out and get Burtons of the world? Thanks. Unless you're referring to tight end premium ADP, if it's tight end premium scoring, you're going to have to take tight ends earlier than what their ADP is in normal drafts, because people will be thirstier for the tight end position. But my stance holds true in tight end premium leagues for the most part too. You'll want to either target a player like Gronk, or you'll want to wait until you get the tight end 12s of the world, the Trey Burtons of the world, as you noted. And I did want to note that I don't see the top tier as a big 3 at the tight end position. I don't think Zach Ertz belongs in that discussion. There's some negative regression coming from that passing offense, and when doing projections, there was a pretty clear dip from Gronk and Kelsey to Zach Ertz. But if you need some more info on tight end strategy, you can listen to episode 149 where I break things down. This next one is from @BellaPraise. Is Golladay replacing Tate making Jones Jr. upside looking promising? So for those of you who aren't aware, there was a report this week about Kenny Golladay playing in 2 wide receiver sets with Marvin Jones, which would then leave Golden Tate sidelined. And I wouldn't read all that much into that report. Not only because I think there'd be a rotation in 2 wide sets, but because the Lions will have all 3 wide receivers on the field plenty at the same time this year. They played in 3 wide sets at one of the highest frequencies in football last season. I still think Golladay hurts Marvin Jones more than he hurts Golden Tate. The on-off splits that I shared in my Players to Avoid podcast highlights this. When Babytron was healthy last year, Jones averaged 5 fewer PPR points per game and 4.5 fewer targets per game. And it makes sense given where they're lined up on the football field. So I'm not reading that much into the report, and I still think that Golladay hurts Marvin Jones more than the consensus does. Jones is absolutely a fantastic player, but the upside is still tremendous for Kenny Golladay as well. This next question is from @ISaidI'mBusy. How much do you play the ADP game when making selections, particularly in more casual leagues? So I got this question multiple times this week in different variations, so I'm going to try my best to be pretty detailed here. I use ADP for the obvious reason of seeing where the market is valuing players. Every ADP source is going to be different, but they are usually not drastically different. What you should know when looking at ADP, though, is how that ADP is being generated. Is it by random casual fantasy players, or is it by people who are playing in high-stakes leagues and have money on the line? In both cases, utilizing those average draft position sources is absolutely fine in my opinion. Because if you look solely at the high-stakes ADP during your home league draft, you're not going to get as good of an idea as to where certain players are going to be selected. And then the opposite holds true too. But you should utilize high-stakes ADP though just to see how the consensus is viewing players. That's a different type of discussion. ADP is there to help you figure out the market, but it's also there to see how everyone is viewing particular guys. It's basically a rankings list that you'd get from me or another fantasy analyst. And while ADP has a weak correlation from preseason projection to postseason result, it's not a bad indicator when compared to how a random person would be ranking players. It's not like ADP is some worthless piece of predictive information. My general rule of thumb is that I don't stray far away from ADP through the first 5 or so rounds of drafts, but I'll begin to grab players I tend to like more than the consensus when I hit round 6 or 7. And it's because the opportunity cost in being wrong early is much more significant than when I'm wrong late. Like if it's the 10th round and you really, really want Taywan Taylor, but Taywan Taylor is a 14th round selection, reaching for him by 4 rounds at that point in the draft isn't that big of a deal. But picking Kenyon Drake in the middle of the 2nd round is, because you're foregoing the opportunity to have someone like Devontae Freeman. One of the other reasons I tend to utilize ADP is that I know that not all of my projections and forecasts are going to be right. So when I utilize average draft position data, I can try and extract as much value as possible with a certain player. And if there's a certain player that I'm targeting and I don't get him, I'm still okay with that because there are plenty of reliable fantasy assets out there, and that player still has a chance to be a bust anyway. So let me run through an example. It's the middle of the 5th round, and I really want Duke Johnson, but Duke Johnson also might go in the 8th or so round of a casual league. If Johnson is the highest running back on my hypothetical draft board, I still won't draft him in the 5th round, knowing there's a good chance that he'll be there at least in the following round. So instead, I might get a player in my rankings who's just closer to that ADP. Because be real with yourself, you guys. Even if you love Duke Johnson, there's never certainty in fantasy football. There's variance. And by you extracting as much value as possible, you're embracing that variance. You're embracing being wrong, and that's a good thing. As for which data source I use, it's going to change by league. If I'm drafting with a home league on a site like ESPN or something, I'll want to look at that site's ADP beforehand and see where I may be able to pick off some value based on my own projections. If I'm doing a live draft where there's not a consensus ADP sheet in front of all of us, then I might get a little bit more aggressive. In the example I just talked through, I may get Duke Johnson in the 6th instead of the 7th. And from experience, I've found that live drafts often are the least predictable because everyone is coming at it with a different consensus rankings list. So know where you're drafting, know your audience, and use ADP from particular sources based on that audience. It can help you extract a lot of value during your draft. That's it for today's show, though. Thank you guys for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, and Stitcher. And make sure you're following me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your weekend.